You know, another thing that I have not talked about on my channel is emergency gear or an emergency kit. You know, worst case scenario, you're a long ways away from any help. You have no cell coverage, and there's nobody that can go and get assistance for you. Those are two different ends of the spectrum that I think requires different levels of emergency gear. So unlike a conventional lacing system where you have eyelets and shoelaces, the bow system has this rotating ratchet mechanism and some wires. And I assume the wires are fairly tough, but the system may not be indestructible. So what happens if you get a failure in the system? How are you going to tighten it back up? Well, what I've done is I'm carrying a couple Velcro straps. These are, you know, they're probably 15 inches, maybe 16 inches in length. And they're just a Velcro cinch strap. Let me go ahead and loosen this boot up. Let's loosen it up all the way. Let's go ahead and let's slip a Velcro strap underneath the heel. Let's try and tighten this up like this. And then I've got a second one here. I'm going to put it around the boot about midway, maybe right about here. And tighten that up. I'm not going to ski a long distance with it. There's no reason to do that. I should know in a really short, reasonable distance how well this would work. Well, the system's definitely not as tight as what you get with the boas, but I think it would work very well for getting you out through an emergency situation. I'd be happy with that. One thing that everybody should be thinking about is what happens if they have a binding failure. You know, it's not that common. It does happen. And over on the Telemark Talk forum this last week, somebody had a binding that pulled completely out of their ski, and they had put the binding in with epoxy. They were a little baffled of why the binding popped loose. The best thing is obviously make sure that your skis are mounted properly and that you have confidence in who mounted your skis. Now, I've skied for a lot of years and I put a lot of miles in the backcountry, and I can only think of one time in my complete history where I was with somebody that had, actually their ski broke, and it broke right where the binding was mounted into the ski. I myself have never had any issue. I've never broken a tip. I've never had a binding come out. I've never had a binding failure. When you have a long history like that without any failures, it's pretty easy to get complacent about it and think, well, I don't need to carry any gear along with me. You know, it's just not going to happen. The likelihood of it happening, you know, might be pretty remote. This year, it made me stop and think a little bit. You know, I've jumped into a brand new binding system, you know, the Explorer system, and with the Rotofella sole. And I don't know how many miles they've put on it. I don't know how extensive they have tested it. But I just, you know, raised a little red flag back in my mind, like, oh man, maybe you better be thinking about what would happen if, for some reason or another, the connection between the boot and the binding fails. Now, it's certainly a more complex binding than like the 75mm 3-pin. So buried deep down in the bowels of my pack, I have an emergency system that I carry. Now this is it. It's pretty lightweight, and I'll go over the entire emergency pack with you back at the house. But what I want to do today is I just want to pull out my emergency binding, put it on, and let's see how that works. So that's it. This is something I've created myself. I'll go over it a little more closely at home. Now what I've got here is I've got a C-clamp that can be used to be attached around your ski, and you can tighten this down with a screwdriver or wrench, and that gives you a really nice, good, sturdy platform for attaching anything to your ski. And all I've done is I've made up a simple little harness system here, and it goes around the ski like this. Right now I've got a Volet mini strap on here that I'm going to try using today, but if I was certainly going a really certain long distance, I'd want to just pull this out and slip the C-clamp in there and tighten that down. Not only would it provide less resistance on the bottom of the ski, but I also think it'd be more durable against the metal edges. I'm just going to put the strap right about here. I'm going to take the Volet strap, and hopefully you'll be able to see this. And I'm going to pull it up so that it's tight on there. Now the idea here essentially is to have the toe essentially held down to the base of the ski, and then to have a strap that comes around from the toe to the back of the boot that you can cinch up, and that'll keep your boot on the ski. Now of course there's not going to be any lateral control here. You know, it's not like having your foot, you're not going to be able to go down, you're not going to be able to make fancy turns. The big question is can you just shuffle along and get yourself out? And you know, I guess if you had to do that, if you had a bunch of downhill stuff you had to do, then maybe you could go ahead and add another strap around here and just go around the base of your ski like a big Volet strap, and give you a little more stability for skiing down. But in my case, what I'd probably do is I'd probably go ahead and just put skins on the skis and just walk up and walk down the hills, and take a shallow enough angle that I don't have to slide, I don't have to turn. I just want the mobility to save myself and get back to the car. So let's walk around on this a little bit. Let's see what this is like. Well, I think this could get me out in a pinch, but I think there's room for improvement. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another strap to the system, so if there's one more that goes a little bit about midway, maybe from about here, so that maybe there's less of a pivot point. So here is version 2 of my emergency binding. It is a little more robust than the one that I field tested. Of course, in the field test, the boot was not placed into the wings of the binding, because if I did that, then the pins would have engaged. So it was a simulation of just attaching the boot to the ski if the binding had pulled out. Of course, if the binding was still attached and the failure was just in the pin system of the boot, then I would have moved the boot forward and utilized the wings of the binding to help with lateral support. Well, that's it for this video. I hope I never have a BOA failure or a binding failure, and I probably never will. But this gives me peace of mind for very little extra weight and bulk. Until next time, be safe and be kind.